Good morning and welcome back to the Reckon Interview Live. I'm your host, John Hammontree, and this week on the Reckon Interview, we have been examining the Southern economy. Today, our guest is my friend Alex Flachsbart, the CEO and founder of Opportunity Alabama. We're going to be talking about opportunity zones. Alex, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, of course, John. Anytime. Coming to you from the Anniston field office of Opportunity Alabama here.
Which appears to literally be a field office, so that's great. Tell us what Opportunity Alabama is and how it came about.
So Opportunity Alabama is a 501c3 organization that was created specifically because for probably since, Reconstruction, there has been a dramatic lack of access to capital for our low-income places. We've sort of missed every other federal program that was designed to facilitate that access to capital. And so when Opportunity Zones showed up back in kind of early 2018, a group of corporate leaders around the state decided enough is enough. We need to actually create a dedicated organization to facilitate access to capital for these places using this cool new tool, this Opportunity Zones tool, as an incentive for doing so. And so that's what we've been doing ever since the last couple of years. We've been building out the ecosystem necessary to do exactly that.
And so walk us through what an opportunity zone is. This was something that was part of the tax bill that passed in 2018. It was something that I believe was introduced by both Tim Scott and Cory Booker as a bipartisan initiative to hopefully drive capital to low-income communities. Is that right?
Yeah.
So what is it? How does it work?
Yeah, back in the day, this was. So you're right. Back in the day, this was highly bipartisan, right? Cory Booker, Tim Scott, but before it, got multiple mentions at the. It has become, I'd say, part of the 2020 Republican kind of reelection strategy over time. But it still is, I think, in its initial form, its initial idea was, look, let's take a place-based approach to economic development, and let's do so in a way that doesn't have all the layers of red tape that are traditionally associated with federal economic development programs. So in the past, stuff like new markets tax credits, stuff like historic tax credits, community development block grants, stuff like that, it was extremely, it's Byzantine, difficult to access. Opportunity zones, much simpler. Every state got to pick 25% of its low-income census tracts as designated OZs. And then from there, it was as simple as, once the zones were picked, finding people with capital gains to invest in anything, any real estate project, placemaking, or operating business in one of these opportunity zones. And doing so creates for the investor this slew of tax benefits. And the way the program was set up, there was no requirement to, like a traditional federal program, apply through some intermediary, no 7 layers of red tape where having to get, an organization, a fund, or a project or whatever certified. It's truly, if a project meets the statutory requirements, if an investor has the capital gain event, it is as simple as calling a lawyer, calling an accountant, forming a fund, and going investing in the project and getting access to the tax benefits. So with simplicity, obviously, comes the potential for abuse. And I think that's where most of the criticism so far about OZs have kind of been leveled in that vein. But yeah, it's in theory a very, very interesting way to democratize the process of economic development.
Well, and I guess one of the things that I've seen is labeling a place an opportunity zone doesn't necessarily mean anything if the investment doesn't follow. Right?
For some reason, my headphones are cutting out here, which is, of course, going to happen in the middle of an interview. So let's figure out why the heck this is not working and try to disconnect these headphones from it.
In the meantime, I will ask everybody who's watching. I'll remind you this is an interactive show. If you are watching and you have questions for Alex about opportunity zones or questions generally about economics, please leave them in the comments. And if you haven't checked out this week's episode of the Reckon Interview podcast, we have spoken with Diane Standard and Stephanie Yates about economic issues throughout the South. Can you hear me?
Hey, all right. So hey, John, now I can actually hear you again, which is awesome. Because before, all I was hearing was just the chirping of crickets in the background. So sorry, all of Reckon folks. John's doing all this right. I'm screwing it up for him 7 ways to Sunday. So anyway, John, sorry about that. What'd you say?
No, that's good. What I was going to say is my understanding is, being designated an opportunity zone tract doesn't necessarily mean anything, right? It's not a magical phrase that's going to turn a tract from low income to high income, it requires kind of a level of investment and coordination from groups like yours. What does it look like in practice in Alabama?
And I mean,
Alex, I think your audio is cut out.
seriously, can you
There
hear
it
me
is. Okay, I can hear you now. Yeah.
now? Hey, all right. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
All right. So, if anything, what's interesting about this, what's interesting about the incentive is that because of the way it's structured, the longer you invest in an area and the more what you've invested in appreciates, the more benefit you get on the tax side, right? So at the end of the day, if I'm investing in, let's say, I don't know, pick something like a childcare center or something else that, frankly, hopefully I'm not going to be asking them for a ton of rent, and I'm not going to be expecting that they pay me a bunch of money over time and pay me even more when I exit, right? So at the end of the day, there's some kinds of projects that don't necessarily work perfectly with this incentive, but what it does is facilitate really strong access to capital for placemaking oriented projects for
What does that mean?
high growth potential businesses in these areas. So for example, if I want to revitalize a new commercial corridor, that's a perfect use for opportunity zones. If I want to invest in a new startup business in a low income place, that's a great use for opportunity zones. If I even we've seen it used for things like broadband. We've seen it used for things like affordable and workforce housing. So it's those kinds of issues that typically don't see a whole lot of other federal incentive coming in. We've seen that OZs have made a huge difference in those places.
Can you give us some examples of how they've worked in practice in Alabama?
Yeah. So at least with Opal, and I guess this is kind of the uniqueness of Opal. We've managed to get about a dozen deals done so far across the state, and they range from everything from a mixed use project in Birmingham that I'm sure if any of you are Birminghamians, whatever, and driving around near Lakeview, you've seen that new Lakeview Green project going up. I mean, that's an Opportunity Zones project where, because of the OZ incentive, the developer was actually able to give back the money that the city had given them as their original incentive package, all the way down to a senior care facility in Heflin, Alabama, population 5,000, that's going to wind up creating jobs for 40 folks and allow 56 area seniors to age in place, all the way to even smaller stuff. And I know I sort of said that these are the harder projects to do, but stuff like the Woodlawn Theater over in Avondale, or over in Woodlawn, where Will Mason Music put together a nice little opportunity fund to go acquire a property that he's going to use half for his nonprofit and half for the first performance venue in Woodlawn in a generation plus. So it totally runs the gamut from big time commercial stuff to, we've done a couple of operating businesses. So manufacturing, distribution. We've done a business, a business that's sort of in the business of that. A couple of larger kind of rural, natural gas and other kind of processing operations. So it's across the board.
One of the things we've been looking at this week is how sometimes policies with the best of intentions don't necessarily always work out the way that they were intended to. What have been some of the drawbacks that we've seen, not necessarily in Alabama, but kind of nationwide with the implementation of opportunity zones?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest drawbacks. So I'd say there's two big federal drawbacks that we would love to see fixed. One is that the way that this was passed, the reconciliation process, and this is true of the whole Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, but any provisions that were not deemed to be revenue generating, were sort of stripped out of the bill, including reporting requirements. So I don't know where dollars are going nationally. I can tell you where they're going locally because we work on the deals, but nationally, I don't have a clue how effective this policy is. As taxpayers, that should concern all of us, right?
Yeah.
So it's one. Two, other governors that were not Governor Ivey, I think, were a little less circumspect in their choice of opportunity zones. So you've got stuff, for example, like the neighborhood into which HQ2 would have gone if it had gone to New York, right? Right across the river from Manhattan. You've got some questionable stuff around Las Vegas. I mean, just just some zones that were technically low income, but that I don't really think should be what we all think of as, opportunity zones. And
Right.
so getting some of those a lot of the negative press you've seen has been about investments in those places. And at the end of the day, the problem for someone like me in Alabama is that capital is always going to follow the path of least resistance. So if it has the option to go into those places and the incentive structure is such that it it gets rewarded for for appreciation, then having those places as a part of the program can be frustrating, right? So and I know that as a part of this is part of what it's part of what both the Republicans and Democrats have talked about as a sort of a joint bipartisan fix to this. And it's certainly part of, I think, both Trump's longer term plan, and I know it's for a fact it's part of Biden's kind of reform plan on OZs. So no matter what happens in November, we're hopeful those national issues will get addressed.
We have a question from Mary Smythe. She says, can you talk about how OZ and the phenomenon of neighborhood gentrification interact to impact neighborhood cohesiveness?
Yeah, so it's a phenomenal question. I mean, so I would say that there is a difference between gentrification and displacement, and those are two things that need to be thought about. A neighborhood property values improving is not necessarily a bad thing if there aren't protections put in place to mitigate the effects of those property value improvements on existing residents, right? So that's where I think an organization like ours comes in. It's needing a 501c3 that can marshal capital and that can deploy it strategically with aligned community partners that are going to ensure that if we're going into a neighborhood and doing a new commercial development, that local residents get a chance not just to work at the commercial development, participate in the commercial development, that it's the kinds of stores, restaurants, et cetera, that local neighborhood residents would want to see, but that also down the road there's some kind of back end exit 10 years from now, which is kind of the timeline of the incentive that incorporates and encourages community. Now, I will say, absent that kind of very intentional process, that kind of very intentional intervention on the part of a group like ours, it's a fair point. And I think it's one of the national, John, back to your criticism of OZs nationally, that's one of the criticisms that is leveled nationally, is that there isn't a good outside check on kind of this pure unstructured incentive. So, I mean, my exhortation to all communities across Alabama and certainly across the U.S. is that this is the first real incentive that has ever created the avenue for conversations between people with lots of money and people that live in places that get investment, right? That could get that investment. And so if you have those conversations, they have so far in our experience gone surprisingly better than we thought they would. I mean, investors, especially now, especially post George Floyd, post COVID, I think are starting to realize the value of what impact means, what it means to invest with intentionality. And so if you're willing to have those, if you're willing to engage with the sort of the quote unquote other side, it's remarkable the kind of progress I think you can make.
Do we run the risk, I guess, to follow up on Mary's question, of low-income communities having fewer opportunities, I guess, to own businesses in their own communities if people with massive access to capital are suddenly investing in lower income communities? Is that something that y'all are working through?
Well, so one thing, I mean, I not within the framework of this incentive, because by and large, what we've seen with this incentive is it's been used mostly. It frustrates me that this is the case, but because of timing and because of the kind of the nature of the incentive, we've seen it mostly used for real estate so far, and we haven't seen it nearly as much used for investing directly into operating businesses. So I'm not worried at all about kind of OZ investors coming in and capitalizing a bunch of non-neighborhood competitors on the operating business side to local, kind of shops. I think smart developers are going to do a great job of incorporating neighborhood, existing businesses, existing owners, et cetera, into newer developments. And then it's going to be incumbent on us to ensure that rent increases, et cetera, don't drive those folks out, right? That there's a structure in place to ensure that existing businesses can continue to grow and thrive in the places they are.
Great. Alex, your sound is cutting out again. You might be running into some mic issues. Let me see. We have another couple questions, it looks like. what have we seen so far in terms of in Alabama, who has been benefiting from opportunity zone investments?
So far, the Lions, I won't say the lion's share, but I'd say a significant chunk of the investments that we've seen through OZ have gone to our urban areas. So Birmingham, Huntsville, Mobile, Montgomery. And if you look at the way the OZs line out, I mean, all of downtown Birmingham's an OZ, right? All the way up to the mountain. Well, not all the way up to the mountain, but picks up a good chunk of South Side. Same in Huntsville, same in Mobile, same in Montgomery. A lot of their downtowns got incorporated for a good reason, right? I mean, for the reason that at the end of the day, this is a program that can be used to invest both in real estate and in operating businesses. And the kinds of operating businesses it works the best with are startups, are kind of high growth potential businesses. And we actually have seen some OZ investment activity that is designed to catalyze like that kind of economic growth. So, in your broader theme of what economic development looks like in kind of like, the New South, these urban economic development strategies are all rooted in tech growth, tech company growth, acceleration. And we see OZs as a very cool tool to facilitate that, right? So having them be in these downtown areas is critical so that we can see OZs as a source of additional follow-on capital for those businesses to help them grow. The problem is that you kind of then have the corollary of, well, the real estate in those places is also eligible for OZ investing, right? So that becomes, the challenge of if I want to put dollars into a rural OZ project that's real estate versus an urban OZ project, again, capital follows the path of least resistance. If I can do urban, a lot of people do. That said, we've seen, honestly, even maybe more than I expected, investing on the rural side from just folks that locally that have had capital gain events, which has been really cool to see, right? I mean, that's the case. That was the case with the Heflin Center. There's been a couple other folks in West Alabama that have had gain events that just want to do right by their hometown, and this is yet another excuse to make that work, to invest in your own backyard.
If people wanted to get involved or to explore the possibility of making investment in their hometown, like we were just talking about, we'll direct people to your website, opportunityalabama.com. But what are some ways that regular folks can get involved with this stuff?
Ping us. I mean, that's the kind of the beauty of being the one-stop shop for all things opportunity zones in the state of Alabama, is that we get inquiries from all the different points of the ecosystem, right? Whether you're a community member, project sponsor, investor, or just an interested third party who wants to figure out what their role could be, right? Like we've done this with with folks that are at higher educational institutions. We've done this with folks that are just kind of like, run a local nonprofit and want to get more plugged into the local development ecosystem, right? And that's perfect for us because we can then tell the next developer that we get into our pipeline, hey, here's this great nonprofit that you might could work with on workforce training or development or et cetera, right? So truly, it's ping us, and if there's a way to plug you in, that's what we'll do.
We have another question from Mary, and it kind of speaks to another topic we've been looking at broadly this week about the racial wealth gap. She asks, are OZ investors partnering with people of color and others from low-income areas in ways that result in increases in their wealth and the wealth of the community?
That is one of the so put it this way. I want OZs to facilitate exactly that. And the way that we have steered OZ capital in this state, I think, is a shining example of what you can do if you are intentional about deploying capital. So, Mary, I think this gets back to the question you asked before, right? It's all about intentionality. It's all about the person that's steering the capital. By default, are OZs, is it a requirement of OZs to do that? No. But is it something that I think impact-oriented folks like us and like others across the U.S. who understand what impact investing looks like, how to facilitate it, and who our partners could be, both at the capital level and on the ground? Like, can we use it as a vehicle to facilitate building wealth, both at the tops of funds by ensuring that we're getting Black investors into OZ vehicles, and at the bottom of funds by ensuring that the money that is spent gets spent on projects where there are Black contractors and subcontractors and management teams and even developers and development teams, right? Like, that's very important to us. And we ensure that that gets followed through when we're working on projects.
Well, Alex, thank you for your time this morning. And if anybody has any additional questions from Alex, you can find him on Twitter. You can find him on his website, opportunityalabama.com. And I can speak from experience that he will always very enthusiastically talk with you about this stuff. I guess I should end this with a quick note that Alex demolished my team this week in fantasy football. So
I wasn't going to bring it up until you did, John, but I mean, that was just a poor performance. I'm not gonna lie.
It was rough all across the board.
One of these days, and I promise you, when you reach out to us, I'll actually have, like Wi-Fi. It won't just be like trees and voila in the background. So this will be fun. Thank you, John, for having me on, and thank you for doing what you're doing, man. I'm glad more people are talking about economic development in the state.
Thanks a lot. Bye.